I've never watched that show, and I actually never watched his, whatever it was in Hawaii.
Right there he's fine. Half a second later, he crawled out. He had 14 stitches in his head.
Well, guys, let's go ahead and get started. I know we've got a couple things to discuss to be able to move the meeting quickly. We've got a lot of people here tonight, too. We don't want them to have to wait all night as well. So I'm going to start with the FY18 budget amendment. Do you want to tee that off, or do we want to just call Tom up?
I'd be happy to tee it off, and we'll go from there, Mr. Mayor, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
As you are all aware, from time to time, an amendment is needed to bring the budget that you have passed into concert with the reality that the budget has endured over the period of 12 months or whatever period of time that you might be facing at that moment. In this case, fiscal year 18, we amended the budget back in October, as you recall, and that was a pretty significant amendment wherein we changed a number of things with the primary purpose of trying to get the budget in line with regard to the revenues that we projected and those kinds of things. Generally speaking, however, amendments are required when you receive more revenue than you anticipated, you received more expenses than you anticipated, or you took on other projects that weren't anticipated with regard to the budget that you passed. In this scenario, we have a number of things at play, wherein we do have expenses and revenues we need to reconcile with the budget that you adopted, and I would say that with regard to what you're going to see, or what you may have already seen in the memo we gave to you over the weekend, nothing that's totally unusual or should be totally foreign to any of your understanding, or what we may have talked about or whatever. So with that, I'd be happy to defer to Mr. Pitlick for questions that the council might have, or whatever direction you want to take from there.
Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. In your package, you should have got kind of a summary of the budget amendment. And I'll just touch on a few of the highlights of the bigger items. In the general fund, there are several items that go back and forth as far as revenue expense. The bigger one out of the group is the amendment to clear the deficit fund balances in the event center in Hogan, which we had discussed earlier in previous workshops. That in total is a little over $1 million. The funding for that, we anticipate during this current fiscal year, we are going to have some operational savings, some additional revenues, and some savings expense to the tune of about $1.1 million. So we do feel there's sufficient revenue being generated this fiscal year in order to cover that requested amendment for those two funds. There are a number of funds in there that just merely we got some grants that were not anticipated in the budget, so we're accounting for the revenue and expenses for those, so really no budget impact with those. The other large item, which again had been discussed in the budget meetings, was the health fund. There's an amendment request for a little over $1 million as for claims that are exceeding what we had budgeted. And that was factored into the balances we've shown you as far as what we thought the fund balance is going to be, so that has been accounted for in the prior presentation. But this is just to bring that expenditure line item up to a level that would cover those expenses. In total, there's a little over $3.6 million of additional expense. All but about over $1 million of that is covered by either grant revenues or the positive performance of the general fund this fiscal year. So if there are any other questions specific to anything, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Mr. Mayor? Yeah, you bet, Bob.
Thank you, sir. Capital Projects Fund 30, we had hazardous materials cleanup, we had budgeted $186,000, and petroleum cleanup, we budgeted $181,000. And those just didn't occur, is that?
No, that is actually expenses that'll be coming in. If you look right underneath that, the revenues, unanticipated grant revenues.
Okay.
So those were revenues.
All right.
The expense from the revenue was budgeted in the last year, so this is a great.
Okay, so it's a direct offset from the brownfields.
Exactly.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have
Sorry.
just a weird random one for whoever can answer it. Like workers' comp, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it seemed like it was an issue where the state would approve everybody's unemployment claim, whether it was a legit termination or not. Do we have any problems with the state and funding benefits for unemployment that shouldn't be? Because I know I'm struggling with that at my office.
Well, Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, we have a couple issues at play here, workers' comp and then unemployment with regard to, you know, that continual tug of war between the two agencies, if you will. We are going to have workers' comp issues moving forward with regard to the recent injury that our officer incurred here recently.
And I'm sorry, I saw workers' comp and it made me think of unemployment.
Unemployment.
So,
With
yeah,
regard
I
to,
get that one.
no, that's okay. Yeah, that'll be one we have to work with. But with regard to unemployment, I would love to be able to say that those issues have been mitigated and that the disparities of justice, if you will, that sometimes come in those conversations have not been corrected legislatively. Although those conversations have been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, and they continue to go on, which is the good news, I guess. The even better news would be if we had a legislative solution that we've yet to be able to incorporate.
That was the one that WAM was working on, right? One of their projects.
As Carter said, this has been a long conversation about what to do, and someone is basically released for cause. And the documentation is very solid.
I just saw
That they were released for cause, and yet they are granted unemployment compensation as though they were laid off.
Mike.
Is that the correct statement of the issue that they wrestled?
Carter, I don't want to get into real details in this, but with reference to the police department potential of workman's comp, other than that obviously the amounts are going to be pretty significant that'll be involved in that, is there anything else that's of an unusual nature that we need to be looking at or thinking about?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I don't see anything that is a large aberration with regard to what we anticipate. The difficulty we have, as you all know, is we have that history that kind of follows us for the next 3 to 4 years.
Well, yeah.
That
Yeah.
messes with our average, if you will,
Sure.
and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But no, I don't think so.
that's what workman's comp's there for.
That's what it's there for. That's exactly right.
Dallas.
Well, what they do is they raise the rates.
Correct. To compensate, yeah.
Yeah, they're gonna raise the rates on us. Her question though was different with unemployment.
Right.
And the way I heard it is people can maybe get unemployment that have been fired. But, and I see that all the time where they do get it because it wasn't for one of the reasons you would traditionally for cause fire somebody. Like if a person steals and they want unemployment because they were fired, they don't get it. But generally if they came to work late or something, a lot of times that isn't enough for a firing and unemployment pays them anyway. And I don't know if we have that problem.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we do have that problem as it relates to some of the larger issues that are out there. I've seen it where people have resigned and have been awarded unemployment. I've seen it where people have stolen from the organization, and because they didn't last in the next employer, we get dinged because we're within that time frame that the state allows for unemployment to occur.
Do we file notices of appeal when we find that out?
Oh, you betcha. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm not saying that that's happened in this organization in the year that I've been here, but it has been my experience that those kinds of issues are still prevalent, not only for public sector employers, but private sector employers as well.
Right. And I found though it's important to, when you see an adverse ruling like that, you generally should appeal it.
Oh, amen. Amen. You bet.
Chris.
How about the seasonal workers? Are we paying unemployment when their season ends? 'Cause I thought we were, right? And that's a huge problem.
That is a big one. Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I do think, and I really should probably double check myself, but I do think that we have gotten some solution with regard to that issue legislatively. But to be more correct, I probably ought to look into that a little bit more. The issue that Councilman Walsh is identifying is where people on a seasonal basis are terminated at the end of their season. They file for unemployment and effectively are able to get unemployment until they're picked up again as a recurring employee for the next season. And then we effectively provide them a salary, if you will, throughout the entire year. I think we may have seen some relief in that regard. Tom, do you recall by chance offhand if that's the case? Or?
I'm basically the same boat, Sharon. I do think I do recall there was some help with that, but I'm not exactly sure.
We'll look further into that and make sure, but hopefully I have a real good answer there for that one.
Mr. Mayor, I know that has also been a RAM initiative too. There's some places that where it's really difficult, Jackson being one. And even in Sundance, the mayor talks about someone who mows their parks.
Right.
They pay me year round. And there's nothing they can do about it, under state law. But I'm trying to remember if they actually passed me. I know there was some initiative, but I don't think they went through.
Okay.
I don't know the details.
We'll
But
do
it is a serious problem.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Chris?
I know another issue that I faced, and I don't know if it's been resolved or not, but you have someone injured on the job here, and if they have a second job, ended up getting dinged with workers' comp on both of those jobs.
Yeah.
Has that been solved, or?
Mr. Mayor and Councilman, unfortunately, no, that hasn't been solved either. There's a lot of those issues that, we have as by way of sort of a checklist with regard to the ills of unemployment, and then that's another one that hasn't received any legislative reprieve yet.
The part that's helpful to us though is that they can't sue us if they get hurt on the job.
Right.
Because we're immune because of the workers' comp. And so they give them a little broader leeway when they get hurt on the job. Sometimes they don't get hurt on the job, they bring it to the job and then it gets exacerbated on the job and then they get paid anyway.
Correct.
Anything else? So you need us to?
Mr. Mayor, as far as that amendment is concerned, we will be bringing it forward in a formal consideration. Is it the 19th, Tom?
Yes, yes.
And if you have any questions with regard to that amendment, we could certainly use that feedback now, and that we would prepare the amendment accordingly and have you consider on a formal basis next Tuesday.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. International building code changes.
Mr. Mayor, would it be okay if we jump to the Katzie discussion?
Not
I
at
know
all.
we've got a number of visitors here tonight.
Is council okay with that? Okay. That sounds good.
We have the discussion this evening for the purpose of making sure that council's aware with regard to the recommendations behind the budgeted reduction in general fund transfers to the transportation program that Katzie oversees on behalf of the city. As we discussed in the budget meeting very, very briefly, we have some recommendations that are consistent to a large degree with the study that the council adopted in concert with the Katzie organization and the board back in January of 17 that for whatever reason had not moved forward or were adopted or whatever. And so what we're proposing is two things primarily. One, that the efficiencies be considered and potentially adopted in concert with the proposal that the budget would assume. And two, consider an adoption for a service reduction that would impact weekend service for the program, basically. And so we wanted you to have the opportunity to ask questions, hear the information, hear from your board and your contractor, and determine whether or not we can move forward with those recommendations and consequently the budget as we have proposed provisionally at this point in time, or make changes in time for us to present you a budget in formal reading next Tuesday with whatever you would suggest this evening. Now, you'll probably recall that the current obligation that the city is accommodating in your current fiscal year 18 budget is about a $315,000 transfer to the Katzie program from the general fund. The proposal that you have for the fiscal year 19 budget is in the neighborhood of $155,000 from the general fund, which would also include $200,000 transfer from the 1% program into the Katzie program. And so we are suggesting a change in that regard, in that the funding would be substantially different with regard from this budget year to the next. And of course, in order to do that, there are things that you need to consider that can make that happen. So with that, Mr. Mayor, if I may, Aaron here has put together some brief information to remind you of pursuant to the memo we gave you over the weekend. And then, of course, as usual, we would welcome your questions and other testimony that you'd like to receive from the board and or your contractor, and go from there.
Sounds good. Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I just want to thank Katzie board members for being here, Lou Grenwald and Carol Crump. And then also we have Marge Cole here, Katzie director, to help answer any questions you have as well. So what I'm going to do is just kind of take you through what we've been up to, give you a quick overview of the Katzie budget, which is can be a very complex budget, but just kind of give you the highlights. And then what are the impacts of the proposed budget? What would we have to do to get us there? And then I'll just take questions. So we started in January with kind of given the task that to look for efficiencies in the Katzie system and to look for ways that we can reduce the general fund contributions to the Katzie system. And so between then and now, we've been working with the Katzie board, we're working with Marge and Carol on what options do we have and what are the best options that we have. So the budget that you were presented with on May 22nd, really the crux of the budget shows a reduction as city manager stated, a reduction in the general fund. And so, as you can see here, there are four main areas where revenue comes from for the Katzie budget. It's general fund, 1 cent, Katzie contracts, and that's a variety of areas of revenue. And then those are matched with FTA grants. All of those local funds, general fund, 1 cent, and Katzie contracts are matched by federal on a 1-to-1 ratio at 50-50 or 80-20 based on if it's operating like gas and salaries versus capital such as fleet stock. And roughly for every $1 that we put in locally, we get about $1.35, roughly more or less, from the federal government. So this is just kind of an idea of where we are compared to last year. And again, with that reduction from general fund, we're facing probably somewhere between a 15 to 20% reduction in the budget. So how do we get there? We've reviewed several options, but they all kind of come into two different piles, or two different categories. One is just simply looking at service reductions, whether that's just reducing hours, or we've also reviewed eliminating Saturday service entirely, and then route modifications. And these kind of findings of efficiencies in our bus routes include eliminating some areas where we think it can reduce costs but affect the least amount of riders, or just means kind of reducing service in certain areas or tweaking routes in other areas. For the budget that's been proposed to you, we looked at kind of, we call it a package. It's really just, it's a bundle of different ways that we think things that we would need to do to achieve these savings. To achieve the savings that is proposed in your budget right now, we would be looking at possibly eliminating Katzie and the bus Saturday service, eliminating portions of the green, blue, and purple route. That includes stops to Smith's Pharmacy and Fort Casper area, making adjustments on the red route, and then reducing services on the yellow route. And that would be to achieve the budget as it stands today. Another package, or another, I guess, example that we're showing is what would it look like if we didn't eliminate Saturday service, but still showing those route modifications. These route modifications were taken from a route schedule analysis and study, and Pam has a couple copies for you all to take a look at if you haven't seen this. So this document was adopted January of 2017. And so a lot of these recommendations, these route modifications specifically, come from this study. Several scenarios were put out in the study. What do you need to do or what are the ideal modifications if you're facing budget cuts? And so that's kind of where we gathered these and how we prioritized these route modifications. So if you have specific questions, you can answer them, but speaking generally, these are kind of the route tweaks that we're looking at.
Bob? Aaron, I think Bob's question.
You didn't have the question thing up there.
I'm ready. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. And Marge here is obviously a wealth of knowledge and is happy to take questions as well. So between the two of us, I think we can cover whatever questions you have.
Aaron, these route modifications are the route modifications that we discussed at the MPO policy committee meeting, is that correct? When this data was presented to us?
Right. And there are several recommendations. We just we reviewed the ones that we felt could be implemented as quickly as possible, that just made sense for our situation. So some of those modifications that you may have discussed aren't included in here, others may be.
Charlie, or excuse me, Dallas, and then Charlie.
So what group of people is this gonna make mad?
It would mainly impact our senior citizens and disabled riders.
There's another group that I know several people actually that use the bus to get to work at Albertsons. And it's pretty tough for them to change schedule at Albertsons, but eliminating Saturday service for them, it might mean they'd have to get a different job if they can find one. So Saturday service is, I think it's important for our riders. That would be closer to your option 2, I think.
Okay, so I've got,
So wait, I was.
go ahead. Yeah, Dallas is
I
still
wasn't
going.
finished. So, why would they choose that? Why would we choose to do that to senior citizens and elderly people and handicapped people? It almost sounds bizarre that we would choose that. So why was that chosen?
Because you didn't cut the museum stuff. Just saying.
No, my feeling is you could cut $150,000 off of data and give it here, and you wouldn't have to do this to these people.
So
How is that chosen?
Dallas, Carter said he could answer that. for you.
Let me take a crack at that.
I mean.
The question is an
almost
interesting
sounds crazy.
question.
It
Yeah.
sounds crazy to even explain it almost.
There's a couple things at play. Again, we're talking about efficiencies that we're trying to gain, which I would argue in any portion of your organization, if you have efficiencies that you can look at, you should. Whether it be Katzie, whether it be the way in which you mow parks, whether it be the way in which you patrol streets, you should always be evaluating efficiencies. And I would tell you that the efficiencies that we're talking about may or may not mean an individual not being able to get to work at Albertsons. So I hate to cast that broad brush of a statement on every single change that potentially we could be talking about here. So if indeed we're talking about Saturday service and eliminating a service that individuals can be taken advantage of, then yeah, that's a piece of the puzzle you want to consider. But to say that the maimed and the halt and the poor and the afflicted are not going to be able to do things in this community as a result of some of these efficiencies, I just can't go to that extreme with regard to everything that we're talking about here. I do know that service reductions are a critical consideration with regard to any service that you offer, because certainly you don't want to impact the community as much as you possibly can. But when you're talking about efficiencies and whatnot, I think you have an obligation to consider efficiencies, and I think you need to be determining ways in which we can better provide a service. And that's what the thrust of the study was that you initiated some 2 or 3 years ago.
Carter, when he said that, my guts tightened in the mouth.
Yeah.
Usually there's, I mean, I would never vote for that, just the way that was explained to me. To do that to these people that are old and afflicted. It's basically, one of the reasons is I'm not that far away from it myself. And I've had people tell me, that are worried and I had a couple emails about people knowing that their time of driving is about up, now what are they gonna do?
Right.
Boy, can't you find something else to cut than this?
I've heard that before.
I know you have.
So I've got Charlie, Chris, Jesse, and Mike. Go ahead, Charlie.
So I do think it's important, based on some of the emails that we received and some of the concerns people have expressed, that we're not talking about eliminating Katzie or the bus. And some people seem to be perceiving this that way. I didn't have a chance to look at this, Aaron, but does it talk about cost per rider on some of those less traveled routes? Have we done those computations? I think from an efficiency standpoint, those are the numbers that we should be looking at. If it costs, I don't know, $20 per rider to get somebody from downtown to the mall on Saturday or whatever, those are the things we should be looking at to say, is that really worth it for that one person? Yes, is there someone who's gonna be impacted? Of course, but, and is that how those changes were arrived at?
Yeah, exactly. The route modifications that we're looking at, we tried to pinpoint the ones that had the greatest savings without impacting while impacting the least amount of riders, or looking at routes that possibly had. I guess what I'm trying to say is the changes that we're looking at have the greatest bang for their buck. And in looking at which routes are most efficient and which routes maybe aren't so efficient, we're trying to look at ones that aren't so efficient and do have that lower, or the higher cost per rider.
Just follow up, just to make this more concrete, can you tell us generally how many people are currently riding the bus on some of these routes that we're looking at either eliminating or or tweaking?
Marge probably knows the numbers better than I do. I can tell you that on Saturday service, for instance, sees about 18 to 20,000 per year. Those numbers are rising though. As far as specific legs of certain routes, I can't say we've narrowed it down that closely. Maybe Marge, can you add to that?
Mr. Mayor, Council, I can tell you what the most efficient routes are and what the least efficient routes are. The blue route is by far the most efficient, goes up and down 2nd Street. The least efficient route as far as number of people is the red route. Mills and Evansville, they tie into this, but they basically pay for their system separately from what the city's involved in. So yellow was very productive until we made the change of running every other hour, but that has started to turn around. Green, the north leg is very productive, and the leg going to CY is not. So I can tell you those. I can't tell you without the information in front of me numbers that I can tell you as far as productive goes. Okay. Okay. Saturdays, weekends, year-to-date April, Katzie, 1,480. The bus, 18,374. Okay.
Thank you. Chris?
Charlie was touching on some of it. I mean, it would help me to make decisions when we had this information presented, and I had to use my calculator to figure out what the total number was when we, last year's budget to this year's budget. Sets off red flags when I don't get to see those things spelled out. And I think before we can make a decision on this, I'm actually shocked that the number's that high on Saturday. I would like to see what the rider numbers were by hour, by day.
Don't have it with us, though.
No, I understand, but that's how you can make a valid decision on efficiencies. Especially when who to impact, elderly, handicapped, and people that are going to work that don't have the means to have a vehicle probably. So we don't build a nice amenity and we let people go to work and get to the pharmacy. Unless we're talking one person every 2 weeks on a route, then it wouldn't make any sense, but I don't have any of that information, so I don't know. But if we've got 2,800 people average in April on a Saturday between the two bus systems, we're not talking about one person in Paradise Valley every 2 weeks.
Yep. Something you wanted to say, Dallas?
Mr. Manager, how do you, when you're doing this work, how do you decide which project you're gonna do this to? I mean, I know we have a lot of things going on in the city that I feel could be trimmed a little, and I understand you're doing it to trim because we've asked you to.
Yeah,
So-
you bet, you bet.
So but when you say elderly people and disabled people, it bothers me. But could you tell me how your thinking was that you honed in on this particular way of doing this?
I certainly can, Mr. Mayor and Councilman. The primary discussion that really attracted my attention was captured in your study that you commissioned a couple years ago and was delivered in January of 17, which I realize some of you who are new on the council weren't a party to those discussions and that kind of thing. And so the study, in my estimation, captures the detail and the analysis that Councilman Walsh is talking about with regard to why routes are considered efficient versus inefficient. And so from that standpoint, that kind of data helps me feel much better about bringing forward a recommendation concerning efficiencies. The difficulty that comes with regard to the set of recommendations that we have for you this evening is the efficiency kinds of things, the modifications to routes and whatnot, they are difficult to implement, and they do impact ridership for a time, and they, you know, are ones that are probably less attractive, if you will, to the Katzie organization to follow up with. With regard to the Saturday service, that's a more difficult option to embrace. In terms of implementation, however, it's probably easier to put together than, say, efficiencies are. And so, which probably sounds not so intuitive, and I probably have to turn to Ms. Cole to describe that a little further. But when you look at the combined value of both, then that's what initiated the recommendation that we have for you this evening.
Thank you.
Jesse, Mike, and Bob.
I'd agree with Chris on his recommendations and maybe hesitation in trying to give direction tonight. But when looking at this, we go into the other municipalities and looking at the transfers in, are we getting any money from, Evansville? I think I heard that Evansville is kind of paying their portion. But could I get more information on that? And does that reflect what our budget line items are that's already, I guess, accounted for?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I would say that the recommendations we provide you have that into consideration.
Okay.
But to give you further insight into how Evansville and Mills work, I would probably want to defer to Marge if I could, Mr. Mayor.
You bet.
Thank you. Mills, Evansville, as far as the bus service goes, just the bus, contribute to the local match from the feds, from FTA. We receive it, and then we send it to the city.
All right.
So
part of that grant money.
yes, and then Katzie has Mills, Evansville, bar none, portions of Macomb County that we serve. That money also serves as local match for the federal funds, and it is sent back to the city once we receive it.
Okay. And then next, kind of diving into those line items, could we define the programs and projects that's costing, almost $2 million? So we're looking at the revenue stream. What are the programs exactly that's tied into the transit fund? And, is that what these options are? Is that $1.7 million? I'm just curious, what encompasses all that money?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, to make sure I understand your question completely here, are you talking about with regard to the budget overall that we prepare for your passage?
Yeah, looking at fiscal year 18, for example, programs and projects under expenses is ranging from 1.7 to 1.9 million. So I'm just curious to know more
Okay.
about those expenses, and is there opportunity there that we're not seeing tonight as an option?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, if there are, we would love to bring those forward for your consideration as well.
Okay.
What I'm suggesting to you is the way in which we can reduce the contribution that the general fund makes is through the recommendations that we're providing you, primarily, in my opinion, the efficiencies that the study elaborates upon. If there are other means, I had a conversation with Ms. Crump and Ms. Cole a few months back, and we tried to evaluate what those opportunities might be. And the short answer to your question is there didn't seem to be many of those opportunities. And so, that's why we're here to you in the format that we are this evening, or at least in the environment that we're here this evening, in talking about route efficiencies.
Do you think it's tougher because it's a private organization that we're kind of working with, and then not being able to really see what their expense is on that side?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I wouldn't say so. I think Katzie is a very effective partner with regard to managing our transit and transportation system. The challenge is that when you're talking about a service of this nature, it's just really expensive, and there's not a whole lot of fat to trim in that you gotta have drivers, you gotta have fuel, and you gotta have routes that cover the span of the city in order to be of the best service. And that's where the challenge comes in making the budget leaner and leaner. But in the same token, I do think the conversation needs to be had about this service as we have every other service in the organization.
Is there more CDGB funding that we can put towards that? Is that captured under the federal grant line item for, offering tokens, for example, for their ridership? Is that what we see up here or saw up here?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, CDBG funding does provide the token program, if you will. I'd have to defer to you two as to where that might show up in this particular budget for the token discussion. I can't remember.
CDBG funds were included for fiscal year 18 under Katzie contracts. And so that has, and so this year we're not including it with the idea that it may be going away. And that was used not towards operations, and it wasn't matched by federal funds, but it simply went towards providing those tokens towards low-income riders. Does that answer your question?
Can I ask a question in addition to that? Are the tokens used for just the bus, or are they also used for dollar ride?
Tokens are used just for the bus.
Just for the bus?
Yeah, the
Okay.
tickets are used on Cats.
Is it the
Because
same
the-
funding program then for both?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
but there is no money in the current budget for any of the tickets or tokens.
If CDBG goes away, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
I think we need to explain also about our budget. The Katzie budget from this year to last year was a flat budget. There have been no increases for staff in about 3 years, 4 years. We haven't given the drivers any increases. There is no administrative fee or anything like that in the Katzie budget. The Katzie budget increased significantly this year because our costs to repair the buses at the garage, the fee was raised from $58 an hour to $85 an hour. There's also an increase in fuel. Those are the things that are making an increase in the Katzie budget, but there's nothing of operations that is changing the Katzie budget. It's
Great.
pretty well flat.
Thank you. I just had one more for Aaron. The map that you had on there, is that what's being proposed, or that's what's
This is
currently in
existing.
place? And then,
So what's being proposed is a few recommendations from option 4, which looks like you have pulled up, and then a few modifications from another recommended system change. So it's really kind of picked and choose which modifications we thought would be most easy to implement and most appropriate for circumstances. So, yeah.
thanks. And then all I have to do, in closing, I would support Saturday operations. Getting rid of it or keeping it?
Mike and then Bob.
Well, I have a couple observations and kind of questions. Efficiency is a wonderful word, but, if we worship too much at the altar of efficiency, you can become too efficient, and you're not serving the need that needs to be served. One of the questions that I have, and I know this might be a little bit tough to kind of quantify, margin, and I don't know how you guys could do this, but I'm presuming that all of the ridership population is probably needy in some manner. There might be some that just ride it out of convenience or because they don't want to use their own car, do those kind of things. But I would be curious if there was a way of quantifying the level of need of some of these riders. If we have, for instance, on some of these routes that have low ridership, high cost per rider, but if those are truly desperately needy riders, that might be something that, you know, that we really should be thinking about. And well, maybe we do need to more heavily subsidize those that are really truly desperately in need.
Well, that was the idea of using CDBG for tickets and tokens. When we set up the ticket and token program from CDBG funds, all of those individuals qualified by their percentage below poverty level. So we ended up, and I didn't bring the numbers with me, but we ended up last year with about 1,000 people that got tickets and tokens, and they.
Yeah, and I apologize for interrupting, but what I would be curious is if there's a way of correlating that, those most needy in that category, in those categories, correlating those to how those people would be impacted by any of these route changes, by deleting Saturday service, that kind of thing. Because to me, if we're impacting the most needy of the clientele, that bothers me. You know, like, you know, Dallas is sitting here, I think, kind of agreeing with me, that troubles me more than if we impact people that are less needy on the scale of neediness. And I don't know if there's a way that you can quantify those kind of things or not, or if I'm just dreaming about, you know, trying to make introduce a comfort factor into some difficult decisions, or what.
It's hard to quantify the bus because anybody can get on the bus. So it makes it, and the bus has greater ridership than Katzie. So it's hard to quantify by income, for example, the people that are getting on and off the bus, because you have no way to tell.
Well, can you tell by, you know, how many are wheelchair bound, by how many are, you know, those kind of things?
We track all those things.
And I think that's in here, isn't it? Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
I wonder, is it possible to tell which routes garner the most tokens and tickets? As kind of an indicator as
That's
to
a
what
daily.
Councilman
That's a
Huber is
daily.
talking about?
That's a daily track.
So if you look at the
Daily.
amount of tokens and tickets per route, that might be
Yeah, and it will
reflective.
correlate directly to the number of rides provided on it. But it's not going to necessarily indicate who's the most needy of those individuals with that fare box.
But they do have to be eligible in order to receive tokens or tickets, correct?
Yes.
On an
And-
individual basis.
But they can purchase them as well, so that, you know.
And they also don't get, no one gets the number of tickets they would need for every ride.
No, that was never the purpose of
The
it.
purpose was to help those individuals. So because the funding was limited, each of those individuals got a limited number of tickets.
And they still do.
And they still do
Okay.
until the money runs out.
Gotcha.
So, you know, it's, even at that, even you using that criteria, you wouldn't have a judgment of the whole ridership and all of their needs.
In the preliminary work that was done for this study, I know there's a lot of survey information that I'm sure we have access to that could provide some detail to the question that you're asking.
But it's 2 years old, so.
Yeah, things change over time.
Well, and I can certainly appreciate that in any kind of a service-oriented enterprise, and this is a service-oriented enterprise, you can't just say, okay, here's our model, and we're gonna have this forever. You know, you have to look at what demand is and how to best answer the demands. And also I'd be interested ultimately in, you know, what kind of analysis you guys did, Marge, or whoever, for, you know, how you're tracking along with meeting the demands and the needs of the people that need this service. And because that's kind of the efficiency that I'd like to see us pursuing. And, you know, I have to say, and I'll just make this general observation, I would put supporting Katzie as a very high priority, not a want with a need kind of a thing in the budgeting process. And those are, and because other than that, Charlie and Chris addressed most of my other real big concerns there.
Bob?
Thank you. Just a couple of observations since I've worked on the MPO policy committee and, you know, have been through this. This report really, if we could get it out in our file system, what's the magic files you go to?
The info packet or the?
Yeah, the info package, it's really worth it, and it answers a lot of the questions and a lot of the heartache that the group went through when they made some recommendations. Another observation, and that's only because I live less than 100 feet from where the major bus stops are, where they all come together. I can sit on my front porch and I can see who gets on, who gets off, and every time I walk downtown, I walk right by those people sitting there waiting to get on the bus. It's busy at 7:30 in the morning, and it's busy at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's pretty busy every time in between. There are, as far as people using Saturday service, for the older generation, me included, I'll include both of us tonight. And that's not as important to them on Saturday as it is during the week, because typically if those people are going to a doctor, the doctors typically only work 5 days a week. The other thing that happens, if they want to go get groceries or go to a Walmart, they prefer not to go on a weekend when all of us younger folks are going there because they got a day off. So I don't think that part of it is really as important for that piece of it. So I still think the Saturday service is important for those people that really need transportation. Those are the people that typically ride the bus, folks who need transportation and can't afford a car. I am pretty sure there are not too many Corvette drivers riding our bus system. So, just some observations, but you guys do a wonderful job, and it's a service that the city needs. We need to provide it as best we can, and I really hope we can continue to do it at the best level we can afford. But I think we have to keep in mind that you know, times are tough. But I'd be specifically looking for other places to save a little more money. But if we have to go with one of the options that we've listed here, your option 2 to me looks like probably a really good way to go. But if we get a chance to read this, and I know it's a thick report, and going through numbers on who's writing what at what time is a little boring, but it is an important system. And one thing, for our own selfishness, being city council folks, every car that's not driven by somebody driving in that bus is another car that's not on the street. Thank you.
Chris, Keneen, Dallas, and Charlie.
I've got a couple, if you'll indulge me, I'll be to the point. First of all, if I understand right, Katzie is that door-to-door service primarily for people that have a disability, mobility problem, they can't get around. The bus is a public transportation system.
Correct.
So I would recommend if we have to make any changes that it not be on Katzie, that we prioritize what we're looking at, and the public transportation would be the one that faced a reduction. But then again, the public transportation also serves a definite need. And it would, if we accepted that CDBG grant, does that solve this problem?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I would say that there are options we can look at with regard to providing for tokens and tickets that don't have to be relegated to only CDBG. I think 1% can fill a role there. I think there's other things we can look at. I know that former Councilwoman Crump has been looking at grants as well to help backfill some of that need, if indeed council decides to move away from CDBG.
I'm all for efficiency, I do not want to see the services cut unless the data that, and I'm gonna take this, shows that the services need to be cut because no one's using that. We're just running a budget, but I don't believe that's probably the case.
May I add that because of the FTA rules, the services have to operate at the same time. If you cut the fixed route hours, you would have to reduce Katzie's
Oh,
hours.
I understand.
Can't do one.
Yeah, it has to be
So you
equal.
have to get it.
That's a federal rule.
Well, then,
Can't run
the
that.
bus just got prioritized in my mind the same as Katzie.
Well, and the other thing council needs to realize is one of the reasons we started the bus back in 2005, the bus is cheaper per ride than Katzie is. So one of the ideas of starting the bus was that if we had some able-bodied people who could manage to get to a bus stop, who were using Katzie, get them off Katzie that costs X number of dollars a ride, get them on the bus, because it's cheaper to rent the bus. And that worked,
It's happening?
Yes.
yes. The ridership on Katzie dropped when the bus started, and it has continued to drop. Now we're hitting another threshold because of our aging population. And our aging population, now more of them are needing the Katzie service, so we're seeing a little uptick in the Katzie service. But the two, really the idea was to balance each other. Because we have fewer Katzie buses, for one thing, and it's not very efficient to go door to door and pick up somebody and drop them off. They now have to call 2 days ahead to even get a ride on the Katzie bus. If you can take the bus, you just walk out your door, go to a bus stop, the bus shows up. So, part of the efficiency that's built in by having the two systems is it makes it easier for the system and it makes it easier for the riders.
In Katzie's
Mr. Mayor, can I
service
follow
area,
that?
can I add that Katzie's service area is larger than the bus?
Yeah.
It serves a much larger area than the bus does. Because the bus only operates in Mills, Casper, and everything. That's it.
This study's was put out January of 17,
So, January 2017, yeah.
and so my sense is this is not accurate data. This conversation's simple as far as I'm concerned. We get up-to-date data. You ride your mountain bike on a gravel trail instead of a paved trail, and we get people that need services.
Kenny,
I think it's pretty difficult for us to focus on the boomer generation and being senior friendly if we're going to try to cut services. And I don't mean to be a nag, but museum, seniors and disabled, I think we can shut a pool down. I mean, let's face it, amenities are not necessities. This is a necessity, so I think we should bring back the museum proposal. Just saying, if we need to save money, which we do, then it's gotta be on amenities and not essential stuff that helps people live.
We may see that in Jesse's request too with the expenses.
It'd be nice to see.
Dallas.
You recommend we do this?
Well,
I'm putting them on the spot, Bob.
the mission we were given. We put
Well,
together a budget every year. The mission we were given was, there will be X number of dollars, figure out how to make it work.
Remember, I'm aware. I just wanna know, do we recommend this? Did we
Can I
Yes or
answer
no?
that?
Anybody
Sure.
wants to.
I would add that the efficiencies that city manager has been discussing should be done in the system. Doesn't necessarily mean reducing service, but it does mean doing away with a route that nobody uses, a section of a route that nobody uses. So that, yes, I think that absolutely needs to be done.
I think we should shut the museum down and take the money there.
That's certainly not our.
I think we
No,
should
that-
take-
I
No,
am not an
that's not-
advocate for shutting
Anything.
What
anything
about
down.
take $150,000 from KDED to How about that one?
Dallas,
That gets to be your job.
Dallas, you're being a lawyer. If we had our druthers.
I can't help myself.
If we had our druthers, we would, as we have done in the past, continue to tweak the routes to make them more efficient. This isn't the first time the routes would be tweaked. We're very comfortable with doing that periodically and making the adjustments of what needs to be done. When it comes to cutting service, we realize how uncomfortable that makes the population we serve. So it makes us just as uncomfortable as it makes that population. But we are not the funding source. You are the funding source. You provide the local match that gets the federal funding that's half of our budget. So, you know, it's your decision. All we can do is try to help you make the decision and come up with what might be the least objectionable alternative for our riders.
Charlie and then Mike.
Thank you.
Well, I remember when the bus was created in 2005, and I do think having a public transportation system that a community can rely on is a mark of a functional community. And it was a big deal, and I think it's still a big deal that we have the bus for people who have no other option. And I also think that those of you who put these routes together came pretty close to hitting the bullseye on the first try in terms of coverage of the city. But I also know that when those decisions are made, you make some fairly arbitrary choices about, well, this street versus that street. Or we'll put a stop here, but it could go over here. I mean, the routes could be much more detailed than they currently are, for example. And to look at those changes and say, you know, we're abandoning the elderly, or we're abandoning the handicapped because we're changing some of these routes where we have nearly empty buses, to me is a mischaracterization of this proposal. And so I mean, I do think we have an obligation to do the very things that are being suggested here, is to actually look at the ridership numbers and say, you know, the benefit doesn't justify the cost for this segment or for this frequency. Regarding Saturday, I guess I have a question. Are we running a bus on each of the routes on an hourly basis on Saturday?
Yes, in Casper, but
So-
Hills and Evansville do not operate on weekends.
So is there an intermediate position where we could have one driver cover 2 or 3 routes, but they're spaced 3 hours apart, so that if someone wants to get in the mall, maybe they can't go at 10 o'clock, but they can go at 1 o'clock?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that is absolutely the thrust behind the recommendation pertaining to the efficiencies that we're trying to capture. I think those efficiencies would capture the disparities that we're seeing in terms of ridership and empty buses riding up and down roads and everything else. That's what we're trying to find the sweet spot for.
I mean, there would be an alternative to the current, not do what we've been doing, but not eliminate it.
Correct.
In some middle ground where it's still available, but it's not maybe your ideal time, but if you can be flexible about when you go, we'll get you there. By reducing costs, by having fewer buses and fewer drivers.
Or fewer stops.
Or fewer stops.
If we can determine that they are not being filled by people.
And that's the part, the efficiency part you're talking about. It does strike the right chord with me, but I can't stand the thought of there's some handicapped person sitting out on their porch and can't get to where they need to go.
Mike and then Bob.
Well, what we're talking about here, this proposal is to decrease the city's subsidy by $200,000, is that right?
With package two, Councilman Huber, Mr. Mayor, the subsidy would actually become 200,000 versus the 155,000 that you see in your draft fiscal year 19 budget, which means that you would have Saturday service in play. But it also means that you would be giving us the green light to move forward on modifications to capture those efficiencies.
Well, how does that relate to what the level of funding has been in the past?
It would be about $115,000 of a savings to the city's general fund.
$115,000 less.
Correct.
The word savings is a good word, but less is.
Which we would take.
Yeah.
We would be pleased to have.
Well,
Yes.
I appreciate that. And I guess that, my next question is maybe a little bit tough, but, so we're actually talking about $115,000 improvement in the general fund budget. How close would that, if we didn't make that cut? If we put that $115,000 back in, how much violence does that do to the balanced budget concept that we adopted?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, if I understand the question correctly,
I guess what I'm asking is how close was our margin?
for the fiscal year 19 budget,
Yes.
the margin was extremely close. And so we would be, upside down
Okay.
by that amount, if you will. And I don't mean to say that all of a sudden we'd be pulling from the reserves and
Well,
those
the
kind
blue
of
line
things.
would be
but-
closer to the.
Yes, that's correct.
Line.
Yeah,
The
you bet.
way that you did
Yeah,
that,
and that's right. With the changes that we made pursuant to that $1 million, if you will,
Yeah.
we effectively spent that balance.
Yeah, okay.
And so we would in fact then have to work on trying to find that money again.
Thank you. I'm tracking with you now on
Yeah.
that, because like I said before, I view the Katzie thing as a need, not a want. I'm very much all in favor of the idea of sitting there and, I don't wanna see buses running around empty any more than you do. And if there's a route that has no ridership that doesn't justify doing it anymore, well, that seems to me to be a relatively easy decision, even though if there's one rider and it's, that's a real negative impact on that one rider, and my, scale of index of neediness there, but, those are kind of my general feelings on it, but I absolutely agree with what Councilman Powell was saying. I think that this is just it's one of the kind of things that makes a city a welcoming, good thing and a good place versus something that's just going backwards, I think.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple things. This study, even though it was done almost years ago, it really is information that we use to develop the new routes, is that correct? So the new routes are a result of this, so it doesn't really make the data that was generated then worthless. This is how we got the ideas for new routes. So this is where it originated from. In discussions regarding public transportation, both with MPO and traveling and so forth, you go to larger cities, I'm talking like Denver, Chicago, and even smaller ones than that. Typically their bus routes, they think the sweet spot is every 20 minutes. And we have talked about that at length in the MPO policy thing. We know we don't have the facilities or the revenues to get a bus every 20 minutes along our route. It's not gonna happen.
Or the need.
But that is the sweet spot, about every 20 minutes, and be within, I think we say within a half mile, or a half mile of a bus stop. And those are kind of the criteria that these experts here put together in looking at routes. So it's been looked at, and this is kind of the result of that. So even though we're considering dropping a little money, we're trying to get the best of both worlds, I think, with this one right now. And obviously, if there's some way we can get around that, I'm in.
So, I feel like we've talked quite a bit. What, you need a direction from us tonight?
That would be helpful if council's prepared to do that.
So what does council want to do, I guess? Chris?
I'm all about exploring the efficiencies, maintaining the services. If this is, maintaining those services is gonna cost us additional money, I'm hoping we get Jesse's question answered on the expense line that he was talking about. We can decide where we wanna take it from there. And we've got the data. Maybe get that out to everybody so we can take a look at it and what that impact would be on either spacing out the pickup times or eliminating routes because there's no ridership on it. But I would like that supported by facts.
So if we look at option 2 while we're looking at this before it comes before council, we're looking at this and then prepare to go with option 2, is that what we're saying? Or just delay it?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Walsh, I think the analysis that you're looking for is probably contained in here.
Okay.
And so we may have already gotten to much of what you're talking about there. And if council is comfortable that efficiencies are what we're all interested in, then I think your exposure is going to be $200,000 from the general fund, which is really, not too far off from what we proposed to you in your draft budget. And so I'm real comfortable moving forward in that regard because that package does keep Saturday service. It doesn't eliminate Saturday service. Now, you might see some efficiencies captured in Saturday service like you would in the other days of the week, but you're not eliminating Saturday service by going with this package.
We
And
can
so I would
put
feel
in
comfortable.
self-driving buses, maybe?
We haven't analyzed that yet, but we can make this package work if council is okay with that.
What does council think about package 2, making it work, efficiencies? Go ahead. Kenny, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to make sure it doesn't cut any hours off of Katzie's operations during the day or the weekend for option 2.
I see Aaron nodding his head, and I think that would be meaning that he agrees with that statement.
I'm good with option 2 then.
Which, thanks for, because I didn't know the answer to that.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Jess.
Just, I guess outside of deciding on option 2, it'd be nice to even enhance services for certain areas like the food desert north of I-25, for example. And, what would it look like if we did a public partner private ship, put it out to all the grocery stores saying, hey, look, who would love to sponsor a bus on Saturdays or on maybe Wednesday, and maybe they could help pick up some of that cost, but then you have maybe 1 or twice a day going to that place that would be sponsoring the bus for people to buy groceries. Just an option thrown out there.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that sounds like a great initiative, but probably a separate question in my estimation. Because I think that would be a service provision that we would need to consider additional to what we're talking about this evening.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yep.
Sean.
So this is gonna require a public hearing, right?
Do the efficiencies require? Okay.
Yeah, package 2 our threshold for requiring a public hearing is if it affects 20% or more of your services, and this would be right on that threshold. So it would require roughly a 15-day notice for a public hearing and then a 30-day comment period. So roughly a month and a half at least of a public comment period.
Be prepared.
Chris.
So this option 2 is in here, and it's gonna specifically talk about routes, locations, stops. I mean, we can't have a public hearing, we can't make a decision if we don't know those specifics.
I don't know that option 2 is actually discussed in there, but the route changes, I believe, are discussed in there, is that correct?
Right, and
Yeah.
along with the public hearing portion, I would recommend that, going into the public comment period, that we take into consideration what we hear about certain routes. If we're looking at a specific route and, modifying it, and we get a lot of feedback that says, of riders telling us, giving us good reasons why we shouldn't, and we should consider, adjustments somewhere else. I think it would bode well for us to do that throughout that comment period.
Mayor,
My issue is, I don't wanna wait for the public to tell me what the specific route is.
Sure.
Do you
No,
see what I'm
yeah, I
saying?
understand.
I don't wanna do it that way. I would like to know what those plans are.
Before you make a decision, Chris, is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, why don't we all just sit in the audience and have a discussion if we don't have any.
And this is what we, Mayor, Council, this is what we would go to the public presenting. But I think it's important that we always take into consideration what the public has to say.
Darren, would you add the purple, since it's mills, that,
Right. The portions that are being proposed for the purple route, could include mills. So it would include engagement with, the town of Mills too.
So I think if I'm trying to understand Chris, I think I don't know if he's comfortable making a decision on package 2 at all, unless you understand what the routes are. Am I hearing you right, Chris?
I'm not saying stop the process because they're always lengthy, but if I could get that information, if we could get that information, this specific route alterations that we're talking about. I mean, I can read this, but if they're not, the routes are in here, as Bob said, but I don't, might be not addressing the stops and the location. And then if we're gonna have to negotiate with Mills on that, and there's gonna be a reduction there, I would anticipate that there'll be a reduction in revenue from Mills.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I don't think I understand that dynamic all that well, and so I'm a little, I don't know why the city council of Casper would be making decisions on services that are extended into mills. I don't quite get that. So it's a question, I guess.
It's a question. Okay, the way the system works, Mills acquired their own bus. Mills and Evansville both acquired their own bus. Those buses are integrated into the system. Those buses serve the bus. The Katzie buses serve all of the county, Mills, Evansville, bar none, parts of the county, and Casper. So Mills and Evansville kick in enough money to pay for the bus service, because the bus is a City of Casper system. And they also contribute money so that they get Katzie service. Everybody's money comes together as the local match for the federal money. So the City of Casper money from YDOT, money from Mills, Evansville, bar none, and the county make up that 50-50 and 80-20 match that we need to get the money from the feds. So anytime there's a cut in any of the local match, you get less federal money.
I can add to that. Mills and Evansville buses currently serve parts of Casper.
And
They
serve
get
parts.
charged, we only charge them for the service they provide in their particular municipality. But it's been a team effort. Mills and Evansville have been very cooperative. And for instance, the transfer points for Mills and Evansville are Walmart's, both of them. So it's a cooperative thing that makes the whole system integrate and work well. So that's the player of the Mills Council.
And that's why they have to be consulted, not only because they provide the funding as part of their local match, but they're also part of the system. The system on each end of town Mills in Evansville, the transfer station at Walmart wouldn't work without Mills in Evansville.
Okay. Charlie?
I support the second option too. I think a lot of homework was done to investigate, you know, where can we make reductions. But I think, going back to my earlier question, I think it would be helpful for people to hear the extent of the subsidy for these less utilized routes. To help them understand that when we have an empty bus, or we have a bus with one person on it, that we're all essentially paying for that. And that it may be an absolutely essential thing for that one person. It may also be a couple of kids that just want to go out to the mall because they have nothing else to do. I don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's fair for us to, you know, make these adjustments based on the numbers. You know, if we are gonna have a public hearing, there is no way you can make these changes without negatively affecting someone. We will hear from those folks, and some of them will be very powerful stories, I'm sure. But as I said earlier, the routes that we're currently dealing with are somewhat arbitrary themselves, and could have been more expansive, could have been less expansive. They just are what they are. And so, making changes, again, is not always inappropriate. It sometimes needs to happen in order to preserve the system, and also to be able to justify to the people who are paying for it, you know, it makes sense for us to run these routes. There's enough people on these buses to justify what we're doing. And so I'd like to hear some of that information about some of these less utilized routes. What does it really cost us per rider to run a Saturday bus at 5 p.m.? I don't know. But whatever ones we're cutting, I think we should be able to tell people, this is why, and this is what it means when we say it's less efficient, and put some numbers to it. And I don't know, maybe that information is in there. I don't know. I haven't looked at this for a while.
Well, as I said here, I don't know how many people it would impact to close it down on Saturday. I don't know how many people it will impact to do side two. I just don't know that. Somebody come up and say, well, how many people is this gonna have to walk? Now, I couldn't tell you what the number is, and I don't know if anybody in here could.
Go ahead, Chuck.
But I would like to know that answer, Mr. Mayor, and Mr.
I kind of want to absorb all this information too. My thumbs up is to go to a public hearing, because I want to hear what the public has to say on it. So my ultimate vote will depend on what I hear there. I'm not saying that I support any one of these packages as it stands now, because I want to hear information from the actual people who use it, and I want to absorb this information.
Does the bus come to City Hall on the hours that council meetings are? Between 6,
I don't think
9 p.m.
Okay.
So we're okay with that, moving forward? Does that give you enough direction?
I think so.
All right.
And, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, but, Mark, does that give you guys, does the comments and the things that we've offered, our thoughts, are there any other questions or anything that maybe any of us could clarify to you guys because frankly, I'm sort of hoping that you can come back, and I think that several of us are, that you can come back with some things and say, okay, here, look at, here's what this is really gonna mean to people if we do this versus if we do that.
At this point, no, I can't tell you.
Yeah, okay. No, but I mean, are
When we
there
do
any
this-
further thoughts or questions that you would like us to try to expound on or anything to sort
Well,
of
with all
help
due
you in that
respect,
process?
The $200,000 is not enough, but,
Swag.
and that will is not enough. It will result in service, painful service reductions, not just, it'll help with efficiencies, but it will affect service.
If I might, just a quick question. Didn't we do a rider survey within the last couple of years?
Yeah,
Do we still have that data that?
it's
I think I
Is it in there?
thumbed through that and saw
Okay.
it in here.
I remember we did that, and that, so that kind of tells you the people you're affecting, as I recall, but I remember when you did that. Thank you.
Yeah, our budget is, as I mentioned earlier, the budget, and Aaron put it in the memo. With the current operating budget, because of the garage increase, the fuel increase, we're $253, $53,000 in the hole for providing the service that we are currently providing. So we can save some money by tweaking, but we cannot save $253,000. So there are going to have to be some other things besides the tweaks that are outlined in Alternative 2. And, you know, and I don't know what those will be, but I think the council should be aware that focusing on the $200,000 number will not necessarily get you where you need to go.
Thank you for coming
You're
tonight.
welcome.
Appreciate everybody.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Aaron.
Can we do like a 2-minute break?
Yes. Two.
Jesse, there's a bus stop there. Is it where
People at the racetrack want to know if they can run it late for like
Yes.
11:30 at night.
We
Tonight,
run buses.
tomorrow, on Friday.
And we had the public hearing.
They'll be under contract on hours, I suspect, and then there'll be inevitable noise complaints, but
That's the thing, it's just, if you're in North Casper, I mean,
Good
you
chance.
can't.
I can hear them in my house.
Yeah.
but,
11:30 is pretty late.
I think they have contractual hours. Well, the last one I shouldn't say, I haven't been through one of them in about 4 years. I think the hours are
You missed
contractual,
that, right?
Oh, okay.
and the noise complaints will come in, and they'll be valid. So they'll be $2 and they'll be breaking tomorrow.
I think 10:30.
Some kind of gunslinger.
Hey, Marge.
I don't agree.
It's probably a better one for the chief. He'd have to address it.
The car race
That's what
I guess they want it an hour later.
Lots of things.
Inevitable noise complaints, and the thing is that
That's my whole number.
that's one noise complaint that you can measure and quantify.
I love my buses.
I lose track of something, or the buses noisy.
Oh, this is, she just came up with it, the racetrack wants to extend their hours.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the first one.
I don't think so.
Right now? Yeah.
Do your signature, and then I'm thinking he starts at the other end and works this way.
It's tremendous, and especially whenever the prevailing name is. But I don't think we can make that decision. I think it's a contractual decision and maybe a special permit.
Yeah, we're called chief. Because I'll be relying upon the chief.
It's never, and it's like motorcycle lights, they probably get so close to each other. On a still night, I can hear them clearly at my house and other walls. And a lot of people complain about it. It's not horrible, you can certainly hear it. One set of decibel meters, that's actually one where you can follow the ordinance, set a decibel meter Proper distance. Yeah, they're gonna be wasted.
That's exactly why we have contract language in place, we're having to deal with that every weekend. We're not, you know. So my answer would be no.
Yeah, I'm inclined to say, well, it's too late for me to be seeking permission to do it tonight.
They wanna do it tonight.
Is there, are they indicating there's something special happening, or hey, we just?
It's just a very special event, you gotta know how you don't know about it.
Yeah, if they call me, I'm gonna tell them.
Got some, pretty tough
Contract stuff developed.
But since you asked, I did come up with bases loaded.
Good.
I have no
In
idea.
the bottom of the seventh,
It says.
I know that with 1 out,
Kinda happy.
we were down by 3 runs.
And it would be more.
I hit a weak fly ball to right field. That hurt.
In time.
And then the slowest guy on our team decided to tag and got thrown out.
Well, I got my fence done so we can work on your trailer next week.
Oh, okay, huh?
Yeah. I am, but I'd like to be in the county.
What's the best one?
I'm hoping 2 years.
So let me say tomorrow's great.
I'd like to do it really hard horse fight.
We should protect
Do you want that land in the country?
Yeah, I do.
So that's gonna take us a big change.
Well, it's even bigger than the
No, we're not, you're not gonna do that, that costs too much money. Okay.
Barbecue and shots.
Building code.
I need to run for county commissioner.
And then I think part of what's go for number 4 is we'll talk about the legacy.
Yeah, unless you run for county commissioner.
And then one county costs about so we really should be pretty quick.
Is he only halfway through his term then?
Yeah, there's no. So that's my next thing. This is your word.
That's not bad.
I'm one of the three in front of the Republican Party. The Republican Party puts 43%.
So Dallas won't give up on it. Ada,
So who picks him?
Ada won't give up on it.
Republican Party only gets 3. Those 3.
I'm thinking of it, just take down all the stop signs.
Who wants to do that?
I'm kidding.
Oh.
Hey, nice article, congratulations.
My mom's kind of mad. Nothing like exposing the family drama.
Is that kind of what we're talking about? It's not a very good drawing, but just 2 angle iron ears on each end.
Yeah.
And can you
I
get,
was thinking about
Talked a little bit about my
putting a slot horizontally
in that little article.
deeper than where the bracket will attach to create a channel for the electrical come through.
oh, I was just gonna poke a hole in it.
Then we have to tear it apart.
Oh, I see.
If we created a channel, we could pop it in there and then bolt the bracket through the upper and lower members that we made.
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah, yeah, we
then
just,
bolt it, so it wouldn't be welded
just
at
put
all.
spacers in there to make a hole.
I guess you could call it that. Yeah.
Yeah, if you had, no, that's not a good idea. We're just gonna build a brace for his trailer. Well, you just need a brace in the back of his trailer.
All you have to do is say we update it every so often.
What kind of a trailer?
You guys have any questions?
It's his camper.
It's hard to describe.
Oh, one of those.
Yeah,
I have some of those.
I built it from scratch.
Ours are small.
So this is the bracket right here, and we're looking at it horizontally.
My fellow councilman, this
This is a 2x2 square
just a rubber stamp. We do this every
Yeah.
3 years. Please keep that
Cut
in
this
mind.
slot, and then this is the bracket here, sitting on top of the 2x2. And you bolt it through both sides. And this is open space here.
All right, council, should we get
Slide
started?
the electrical in, bolt it here and here, and then bolt it here and here.
I follow. We can probably do that.
And you don't have to cut anything
Yeah, but we only do that on one end.
on one end.
The other end's just a straight L bracket. Yeah, we can do that.
It's done.
It's done, yeah.
So is anybody applying?
Put a pin in that.
You're applying for their,
Oh, they've been applying, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you betcha.
and where are you gonna let them have their Charlie Powell,
I'm not sure yet.
pavilion?
I'm not sure yet.
All righty, let's go into the International Building Code changes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Much of this is pretty routine. Yeah, that's right.
Do we each get a stack like that, Mr. Manager? I wanna read it before we do it.
Hey, we can make that happen. Yeah, look at that. That
Alice
is
can read it
fun
quickly.
reading right there.
I can
I'm
speed
fine
read
at proving that with no knowledge.
In that the state has adopted their codes and we are mandated to follow up and do the same locally with one exception. And we have Craig here tonight to talk about that briefly, or Dan, whomever. And with that, if council's ready to move forward with that formal preparation, then we will be too.
Good.
Thank you.
We're good.
Awesome.
Let's watch the next thing on the agenda.
Can we ask questions even though we're approving it? Is that all right?
Oh, Jesse, okay, yeah, go right ahead.
Do you have a question, Jesse?
Sure. For the maintenance code, so we're saying that's only for new construction, or how is that going to work? Existing homes? And on top of that, how are we going to enforce it? Are we going to start taking properties and billing it back on their water system and then shutting off their water so they can't afford it? They can't even afford a fresh coat of paint?
The International Property Maintenance Code establishes a minimum, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor and Council, the 2018 International Property Maintenance Code, which will be the first time it's been adopted by the city of Casper, hopefully, establishes a minimum requirements for maintenance of existing buildings and contains clear and specific property maintenance and property improvement provisions. And adoption of this code will provide a more specific approach to property owners who neglect their property, whether they live at the property or rent and lease to another party. In the general regulations of this code, it provides 11 different scenarios for unsafe structures and equipment, most of which is due to neglect, deterioration, and it also defines the minimum requirements for lighting, heating, ventilation, and plumbing. I could give you a quick example that Chief Harshman and Community Risk Reduction Officer Ryan Neff were involved with. This winter, as we had a mother called my office, and her son was living in an apartment, and he was using a propane heater for heat because the gas had been shut off, and he was renting that apartment. He was afraid to call because he had no funds if he was to be kicked out. So his mother called, and I believe we ended up having to get a search warrant to go into that property and see that they had stored kerosene and gasoline and other flammables in there, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. And so, you know, these are dangerous situations, and the property maintenance code will give us the teeth to be able to enforce on property owners that neglect their properties, or it falls into disrepair. And it would be enforced both by the building inspection department in concert with the code enforcement officers, and for its complete implementation. And these cases would typically arise through notifications, complaints, or visual on-street inspections. We'd basically be looking for the life safety hazards of the occupants, not that, okay, you need to paint your house every 3 years or something like that. So it's for the safety of the citizens. And we have commercial properties that actually, when we go in and look at them, that it's like, man, we would love to be able to enforce them to have to do some things, and we just don't have that mechanism to do so, and the International Property Maintenance Code will give us that mechanism.
And just if I could follow up, so you mentioned letters, complaints, and things like that. What goes after? What actually is the T? I imagine it's more than a letter, isn't it?
Well, it would give us, by adopting this code, we would have the authority to enforce that code upon those people, just like we do all the rest of the codes that we brought here tonight.
Like fines and.
Yeah, there's fines and stuff that we can go through a legal process if need be.
Just seems.
Typically, when you have the code and you're able to enforce it, and you say here in writing is the code that has been adopted by city ordinance that we need to abide by, I would say most of your people will accept that and begin to do what is required.
Okay.
For in most cases.
I got Dallas, Kenyon, and Bob.
And then I just wanted to follow, I guess, to council. I appreciate that information. My hesitation in adopting the property maintenance code, and then you heard right now, minimum requirements for lighting, and I can get behind kerosene and other unsafe acts that are going on that will probably burn it down, or people around them, or anything like that. But, going and then having government, us, enforce where you only have one light in your whole house, or no lights, or whatever, and you're not maintaining the property, and then if we're going to include fines, what's going to happen after that? Would we then have a lien on their property? How does that work? So I don't like the idea of a maintenance code. I don't think that should be entirely on us. And you have roofs and things like that, and you have an issue where you can say, hey, it's going to collapse, and we don't want you and your family to die, type thing.
I just wanted to give you some assurance. It's when I started this, I was a little nervous. Once I read through it, it's all pretty basic life safety issues. It's not really onerous. It's all common sense kind of stuff, and it's really to protect life safety. And it's not your windows are dirty, or you don't have enough windows, things like that. We really need to keep into perspective what the remedies are, and they're serious. They're demolition, there's condemnation, there's things like that, but it takes a lot to get to that point. That's not something that we do very often. I don't even know if we do that once a year even. So, but I would really encourage council, if they'd like, we can send links, and we can go through some of that prior to the public hearing, and maybe get a better feel for it.
I appreciate that, yeah. Thanks, Ray.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, and I would agree with Mr. Collins and Mr. Elston's review of this, in that there are numerous steps that take place, which include a degree of time, for, in my opinion, generous time to come into compliance. So if indeed we do get a tenant that calls us and says, my landlord is not turning on our heat for whatever reason, we can then have the teeth we need to follow up and make those things happen, whereas now we do not. And so for me, it's rather unusual for a city of this size and sophistication to not have a degree of code in place that allows us this flexibility and ability to try to gain compliance. But again, I stress, it also allows for a generous amount of time for the property owner to come into compliance when notified. So I I've just not seen much where egregious situations are not being met with some degree of compliance and effort to try to work it out.
Okay. It's just tough for me to really harp on this when we have other areas within the city of Casper and surrounding areas for that matter that are new construction. You can't find soil samples. They do have soil samples. Well, you know, why wasn't my house built on caissons? And they're becoming uninhabitable because of structural issues. And then you look at the commercial code and what was the other one? Commercial code. There's two of them that require, you know, basically compacting the soil hardness and things like that. But it's just frustrating that we approve developments within the city of Casper, and then you have the contractor that is either a shady contractor or the brokerage firm, whoever's facilitating it, either drops the ball, and you just have bad parts of Casper that's new construction. You read about it in the paper often, but we're doing nothing about it as this body to change that. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Gallus.
I have a couple of comments. One is, and I've been asked to ask you this before, but my understanding is that, is there a code ruling that has prevented the guy that owns the old Gladstone Hotel, that he can't use that 8th floor for a restaurant?
There is code requirements that if you do use it for a restaurant, that you have to meet the egress requirements.
And so what does that make him have to do?
He would have to increase the egress from that ninth and 8th floor with an A2 occupancy down to the ground level exit discharge. And in doing so, it's not feasible in that building, he feels, to put the money forth to do that.
Well, it's extremely expensive, isn't it? I mean,
Yes, it would be, but it would be very extremely expensive if you had a apartment fire on the 4th floor and you had 200 people on the 8th and 9th floor with no way for egress.
but aren't they grandfathered in somehow? I mean, that building was built in the...
Egress is something that also we are looking at adopting the International Existing Building Code, which the building code itself had a chapter 34 for existing buildings in it. The International Code Council removed that in 2015, and the state adopted the International Existing Building Code. In that code, there is no leniency for egress because of the life safety effect that you would have and the catastrophe you could have if you compromised that.
Well, he has two different ways of getting down from there, doesn't he?
For the number of people that you would have up there, you need a wider egress.
And so what do you think that's gonna cost? Has he told you?
No.
It's like in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It almost sounds like we're being a little too harsh with it. I'm serious. I mean, they've had a
Well,
restaurant
if I know
up
the
there
top
for
floor.
all these years, and now the city wants to change that, a structure that's obviously a grandfathered sort of structure. It just seemed weird to me.
I'm not sure if everyone understands, so I'll just clarify. That existing building code that we're talking about, the purpose of that is to provide some relief from these kinds of things. But they feel so strongly that this is a life safety, this is so important that they don't provide relief on this issue. So a lot of other things we can make allowances for with this existing building code. However, egress and getting people out of that building if something happens is too important.
He is not the first person that attempted to do something with those upper floors, I believe, and then found that the cost was prohibitive to put in the egress required by the code.
So my other question is how come we really didn't address compaction requirements?
Compaction requirements are addressed in the code. They're not an inspection requirement by the city of Casper.
Why not?
Per the code.
Why not?
If you guys wanted to put that in an ordinance where we did that, the increased cost, I believe, on a home, if we were to, I will, actually got a little scenario on compaction if you want me to take the time to read that. The 2015 RRC section 401.4 requires a soils report The building department requires that soils report for each lot in the subdivision prior to issuing a building permit. If there is no soils report for the total subdivision, then the general contractor is required to provide one for the lot he's building on. We have not built any residences in the city of Casper without that soils report. The inspection required by the RC does not include compaction reports. And I have the paragraphs down here that say that. The 2015 IBC in a section there requires a geotechnical report soils for each project. And we also require that for these commercial projects before the building permit is approved. So on your commercial projects, there are special inspections per table 1705, and this is done through a third-party special inspector as approved by the code. Typically, companies such as Ingberg, Miller, Terracon, and Strata are examples that the city of Casper, that these contractors use, that we accept. That you take the high schools and the major commercial projects, I get emails from them on their field reports throughout the project on their compaction and such like that.
But what about residential?
Okay, as I complete the report, I hope I'll answer for you, sir.
Okay, I'll wait till the
Okay. On major projects such as the new high schools and building department, I just talked about the requested most copies, and there is no requirement in the Muni Code for compaction testing of residential construction. There is for streets, sidewalks, and utility trenches. I investigated the cost of compaction testing for single-family residences. The cost test from the local testing agency is $75 per hour plus $1 per mile to and from the site, plus $65 an hour for the secretary and $105 per hour for the senior engineer. A 9-foot foundation would require 9 tests on each side, plus other costs associated, which could be in the range of $2,000 to $3,000. This does not include the dirt contractors that are going to be sitting there with their equipment waiting for the compaction test to be completed. And he has an hourly rate for his equipment. I would assume that a cost for a house, the bare cost would probably be between $5,000 to $8,000 on the residence. If you do compaction tests, you're going to have to do them all. You couldn't just do a portion sporadically here and there and achieve the result that you guys are looking for.
Are there some cities that require compaction tests?
I could not answer that for you, sir.
Because I know, like, for instance, the David Creek Station, they had, everything's been compacted down there.
Yes, a commercial project, yes, sir.
But to elaborate a little bit on something Jesse was saying about this subdivision out here, where all these homes are crumbling and everybody's being sued, what could the city have done to have helped those people to not have that problem that we're not doing presently?
There was a soils report that was given for that subdivision in the beginning, and then another soils report came later. The first soils report, I believe, and I'm just acknowledging from memory, required caissons. The second soils report that was done required an overdig and compaction batching as a footing inspection in the rebar. It's not the compaction or how the contractor will do that. If we were to want to do that, we would need to put that in the ordinance. And we would have the increased cost of the homes for doing so. I might mention that the thousands of homes that we have built in Casper over the last 6.5 years that I've been working for the city as an inspector, that is the only area where we have had this happen. I know one time is too many, but that is the case there. So we cannot look in the future. We couldn't anticipate that because we looked at the inspections that were required for that subdivision according to the code and according to our city ordinances.
Well, is there something different with the soil there than in these other areas?
I believe that, from what I understand from other people that have been here longer than I, that was had some overburden and backfill areas in there, but I cannot attest to.
Well, maybe we should have a code that says when you run into that kind of soil, you have to put in the caissons and compact the soil.
And that's what
Whereas
the soil,
if
that's
you're
what the
saying in
soil
other
report
areas
did say, and then they got another engineer, which I am not an engineer, that stated that they could do the overdig and compact back up to the footing elevation.
So should we be addressing that though? Should we be addressing that for future problems? Because, I mean, Casper soil really isn't the greatest. Every basement in the city is cracked, all the concrete's cracked where there's been no compaction, and it's more expensive to have to deal with that, tear it out and redo it than it would be if you had to do it right the first time, I think. I mean,
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I absolutely think that we can prepare an ordinance that would bring that question to the table and get direction from the council as to whether or not they want to incorporate that standard. But the point at this point in time is that is not a mandated standard by ordinance, and I have every confidence that planning departments of now and then follow the requirements that were mandated of them by ordinance and by other design code fiat. So,
yeah, and I'm not criticizing him for the problem.
Sure.
I'm just saying, should we do something to alleviate future problems like this? Because some of these houses are uninhabitable. They're gonna just tear them down. $250,000 house.
maybe during the roundtable portion of this agenda, we can possibly get that direction from council to prepare an ordinance for your formal consideration. In that regard.
I would too like to have you look into a little more detail to this thing on Mr. Peel's project over there, because this, I was surprised when he told me he couldn't open that restaurant because they want another sort of exit. There's 2 of them there already, and it's been that way since, I mean, I worked there as a busboy, and everybody got up and down. He's putting in a new $350,000 elevator and all that stuff. It just seemed like, I don't know, it just didn't seem fair to me if that's what's happening to him. They won't be able to use that restaurant
Mr. Mayor.
without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Councilman, I think that's another ordinance discussion council can have to make less stringent the egress requirements for floors of that nature. I'm sure we don't have a lot of applications of that type of construction in our community in that regard. But nonetheless,
That's probably the only one.
that could be the only one. If we do, I would really hope that we can get testimony from the fire chief that would say whether or not that kind of an ordinance is a good idea that would effectively amend that portion of the code. But again, I view that as kind of a separate question.
Yeah.
That I would prefer direction from council specifically in that regard.
Thank you.
I have Keneen, Bob, Mike, and Chris still on the docket.
Can we kind of talk about this change as that maybe it would have pertained to like the Casey apartments? Instead of having to shut that down and kick everybody out, would this have allowed us a better avenue and a process to avoid having to make people homeless?
It could have. Mr. Mayor and Council, I believe it could have. Would it? It depends on how far the owner will abide by those requirements that you put upon it. I can't say whether that owner would have, but it would give us the teeth to say that this needs to be done before it got to the point where it was mow it down.
Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think this is a heck of a good idea. This new maintenance thing, it's nothing but to help, give us something to help with slumlords. We used to have a guy's hat that hung right over there. That property burned down eventually, and everybody knew, and we spent gosh knows how many hours on this council trying to fix that problem. Well, it finally did burn down.
What building is that?
House.
I won't go there. So I think this is a really good idea, and I would just like to see us proceed with it.
Thank you. Mike?
Well, if I understood, this is the code that's been adopted by the state, so it's kind of mandatory for us to adopt this,
The
is
state
that
has
right?
not adopted the International Property Maintenance Code.
Oh, they haven't?
No.
Oh, I misunderstood that.
No, they adopted all the other codes except for that code.
Is that downloadable, or do you gotta pay for it to download it?
No, you can see it on, I'd sent it to somebody the other day, so I can get it out to all the council.
Well, so that I understand the specific parts of this code the state hasn't adopted, or they haven't adopted the whole thing?
They have not adopted the International Property Maintenance Code.
Okay, but
That's up to his jurisdiction.
and that's part of the International Building Code.
It is. These are all the International Building
Yeah.
Code. There's 7 volumes, 8 volumes counting the international existing building code now. So comprises of 8 volumes.
Could-
The International Property Maintenance Code
Yeah.
is a portion of that.
Okay, well, because
that
really
is
what
not
I'm
adopted by
asking
the state.
is to get a clear understanding of just what parts of all this are sort of mandatory under the state having adopted all or any parts of the International Building Code versus what parts we are not kind of mandated into.
The only one that we're not mandated into is the International Property Maintenance Code.
And I'm kind of in favor of that. You know, it really would, I think, kind of bring the building code into parity or to match up with what's already in the Wyoming landlord tenant thing and statutes. And so, you know, to me, it's kind of not a big deal that way. But and having said that, if I really thought that the city was going to really start running out and telling people, well, coming into my house and telling me that I have to paint my house because I haven't painted it in the last 20 years. But,
You would be in trouble.
I would, yeah. But,
For many reasons.
But I think this is something we need to just move forward with and do.
Good. Dave? I'm sorry.
That one guy.
You know what, I think Charlie's got a good idea.
Am I premature? Good to go.
Thank you.
One down.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Appreciate
guys.
it. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, did you want us to stick around for the roundtable at the end, or will there be additional discussion?
Is anybody going to be coming up with any additional discussions at the roundtable pertaining to this? Okay, I don't think so. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Are you done?
We already did.
So on the agenda review, Carter has a couple items that he wants to address, and I'll let him talk about that. But one of that is the legacy imbalances, and he wanted to kind of address that with us a little bit tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate that opportunity. We created some spreadsheets that I think will help at least add to the discussion as it relates to the legacy imbalances that we addressed during the budget process. I heard to it referred to as the legacy fund, and I want to tell you there is no fund out there that we use to try to deal with imbalances throughout the organization or over time or anything of that sort. And so to provide a little more clarity, Jolene is passing out a spreadsheet that Tom helped prepare. Tom, okay. That if we could take a little time to go over it, again, might provide for this discussion somewhere. You've got two sections basically of sheets that are being handed out. One of which deals with the event center, thank you, imbalance, and the other deals with the Pogodon imbalance. I say we start with the event center. And so if you could turn to your front sheet that looks like this, that deals specifically with the event center, we can kind of walk through this a little bit. The basic thrust behind what we're talking about here is a situation where over time, for whatever reason, the fund was not reconciled every year pertaining to its deficit operation, which should not be a surprise to anybody that we have deficit operations with regard to the event center. That's been our problem with many facilities in the organization. The event center is not exclusive to that issue. And so what you see here is kind of a tally of how that deficit has looked over the last 5 or so years wherein this imbalance has grown. Now, I'll tell you just to kind of frame the discussion as well, the reason that I called it a legacy imbalance is because I wanted it to be really, really clear that the budget that we prepared for you and that we are proposing for FY19 adoption does not or was not or is not the culprit behind the fact that we have an imbalance of this nature. This is a balance, again, that has grown over time, and we are correcting, in fact, with the budget should you adopt it in fiscal year 19. But let's start at the top of the sheet here. In fiscal year 12, it does appear that post contribution from the City of Casper's general fund in the amount of roughly, let's see, actually I don't know what the contribution in fiscal year 12 was, but you started with a cash balance of about $84,280. Now I would assume that that is a fund balance figure that is net of the general fund contribution that effectively serves as a subsidy to that operation. If you move down to fiscal year 13, fiscal year 13 required an annual subsidy, again from the general fund, in the amount of $593,000. Somehow, the operations of that previous fiscal year generated an imbalance of $300,000 over and above what was projected at the beginning of the fiscal year, that would have provided or would have required, I should say, a true contribution necessary of the neighborhood of about $900,000. And I get to that figure because I add the $300,000 to the $593,000 with each particular fiscal year. Because that wasn't corrected to the amount that it should have been, the fund carried an imbalance of $215,000 moving into the new fiscal year. Now, as you look down with each fiscal year, you can see not only what was required or what was actually contributed from the general fund, but what the result was to the running balance, if you will. And in this case, it was an imbalance from year to year. As you track each of those years, you find that in fiscal year 18, there is a projected imbalance of just over $900,000 in the fund. Now that's a fund balance statement, a fund balance figure that isn't necessarily reflective of what it is that we owe Spectra now each year that they run the facility for us. That's how this chart works, and that's how the numbers grew to what we shared with you in the late part of May. The other thing that I wanted to make real clear is that there was some concern that these figures were hidden. And I would have to say this with regard to that concern. While it doesn't appear as though these imbalances from year to year were brought specifically to the attention of the council, we do find that there is indication in the respective budget books of that imbalance being in existence. And so, while the numbers may not be precisely exact that you see year to year in the budget books that you have passed back in fiscal year 13 or whatever, you will find that there is a very close approximation of what that imbalance would be in that particular fiscal year. And so, hidden may not necessarily be accurate, but I don't think it was brought to your attention very specifically with each of the years' discussion pertaining to the passage of that budget.
So, Charlie, Dallas, and then Jesse.
So, Carter, we just approved a budget adjustment for the current fiscal year. Without pointing fingers, wouldn't that have been an appropriate budget adjustment at the time so that this didn't accumulate over time? Wouldn't that be the process we would use to balance the books to say, well, we're down more than we thought, we need to make an adjustment and pay for this?
Well, Mr. Mayor and Councilman, that's exactly what we're proposing to do with the adoption of the amendment that we're asking you to adopt on Tuesday of next week.
But we have to take care of 5 years instead of 1.
Correct. That's exactly right. And so what you will see from your staff currently is a subsidy payment request each budget year that will cover the true subsidy need for that operation.
Can we just follow up? I'm just not an accountant, so how were the bills paid then? How were these expenses paid if they were just allowed to accumulate?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure I understand those technicalities as well as, say, Tom would.
Somehow we had to pay our staff and all the other expenses associated, the light bill and everything else.
That's right.
And if we weren't settling up on this, where did the money come from to pay the expenses?
Tom, do you want to discuss that a little bit? If you
Sure,
don't mind,
glad
Mr. Mayor?
to. We have what we call a pooled cash system, so each fund does not have its own separate bank account. So the city's money is pooled into a concentrated account. So this in essence was borrowing from that and was reported as a receivable, and it's just got to the point now where it's not really receivable because there's not an ability for the fund to pay it back, so that's why you want to chew it out. But that's where the money would have come from, it's just from the consolidated bank account and a borrowing.
Dallas.
Well, were these two accounts, they were, the way I understand it, probably correct me on this, because I'm not an accountant either, but when these were being reported, they were blended in with all of the other cash businesses of the city, okay? That's how they were carried by the auditor?
Correct, when the auditors come in, they consolidate a lot of accounts, so you don't see a separate financial statement for every account, so they're grouped into 2 or 3 groupings. So yeah, this would have been grouped with some other
So
accounts.
why would anybody do that? It's like, to me, they're putting it all in one account, so you can't see it. Anybody that would look at it wouldn't see what the problems were with respect to pulling the individual accounts out there.
Now, for one reason, I guess, the city currently has about 50 different funds. So to create a financial statement and all the associated statements that go with it would be a huge document. And it is common practice in the city, in municipal government, to consolidate into government funds or enterprise funds. And that's how it's reported in the detail would be in the budget process as presented. And as Carter mentioned, these deficits were in the budget books, albeit a book that big, and
That's how it got by everybody, because it was kind of, for lack of a better word, blended in there, where the average person couldn't pick it up.
but that would be.
So I wonder why that was done that way.
And that was typically the way the budget books were put together. I don't think it was any intentional deceit there. I think that's just the way the books were put together. They're very informational, but they contain a lot of information that you probably, unless you were specifically looking for it, you wouldn't see it. So it's more incumbent upon us to point
But
those
where does
things
this
out.
money come from now? So we're actually going
The
to
general fund.
pay this, is that coming out of the general fund?
Yes.
That's correct. And Mr. Mayor, basically what it amounts to is an adjustment of the books to show real money going into this imbalance, to be sure that it is a real correction of, as the way Tom described, a receivable that has never been reconciled like it should have been. I was asked earlier, in fact, by one of the reporters as to whether or not we're going to be writing a check and handing that check over to somebody. And the reality is that's not how it's done. It is an adjustment, and it does involve real money, but we are not writing a check to Spectra, as it were, to account for that imbalance that has existed and grown over time in the particular fund that the event center was managed
We've
through.
already paid
That would be-
Spectra?
Yeah, Spectra is a different discussion.
Everybody's been
than this.
paid, where is this all you're doing,
It's an
really, is just
accounting
shifting
thing.
money from one account to another?
That's right, but it's real money, which is why we have to tell you that the gains that we incurred through better revenues, better containment of costs, and so forth, are being deferred into this fund and the Hogadon Fund in order to make it all true up, which
So when
is
you shift-
appropriate to do.
When you shift the money, then what happens to the money? What happens to that money when we shift it into this other account?
Balances the account.
It balances the
You relieve the legacy quote account.
imbalance.
It's
Even though
just
it wasn't
it's
ever
just
there.
an accounting thing, essentially. I mean,
But is it real money?
It's real money.
So the real money that's in there now, what do we spend that money on from here on out?
correcting a negative balance.
correcting a negative balance.
But the money just doesn't sit there forever, there's money.
But it'd
that
be
we're
like
gonna
if
use
you
on
had
something.
a budget for your car repair and your home finances, it doesn't bring any money in, so you have a deficit. So if you spend $20,000 on a vehicle repair, you have a deficit, so you take money from your checking account, you move it in there to clear that deficit. That's what we're doing. It's not really putting money into a separate account.
I'm not too sure that I totally agree with that, but I'm not too sure I understand it fully enough to either agree or disagree. So, was that your answer? Was your answer his answer? He tried to answer it, and I'm wondering what your answer is.
No, I think that's a pretty accurate description. I mean, if you have a particular imbalance in your savings account, and you covered the check with, you know, the repair with checking, and you want your savings account to be whole, so to speak, then you got to move money into check savings in order to keep it flush with money.
So it'd be flush, all I gotta do is go write some checks in on my.
We just want it to be
savings account,
even.
and
That's all we're asking. We just want it to be even. That's right.
Jesse, Bob, and Charlie.
I'm good. Oh, yeah.
I was just curious, so that completely changes the subsidy for fiscal year 13 and so on and so forth. So I was just curious, when we initially created the contract with Spectra, you know, how does that change the numbers of what we were anticipating our net loss to be? And does that change the contract complete with them that we have in place, since the subsidy is much higher? Or is that $900,000 target acceptable?
Mr. Mayor, Council, I would say the $900,000 target is acceptable because we've used the last 5 years, if you will, of the true necessity to measure what we should be setting for ourselves as a threshold and benchmark to contribute to Spectra.
Okay, great.
So I think that is the number.
Bob.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, because I was digging in the last 4 budget books, trying to rationalize what
together.
transpired. Well, after seeing what the numbers are and looking at the budgets, I can tell you exactly where the numbers are from FY 15 through 18, but I didn't have budget books for 13 and 14 with me, so. Anyway, this clarifies what the issue was, and quite honestly, it's probably a change in accounting procedures. And I know that happens, and I know there's matters of convention when, what dollars you put where in accounting. And there's certainly no ill intent here that I can see, none at all, just not there. You have to be able to read the numbers, and now that I can reconcile these numbers, I can see what the issue was. We had general funds that were helping offset these overspending.
And the problem is we didn't plug enough of the general funds to truly
Yeah,
compensate.
the adjustments are there,
Right.
but it just wasn't enough of it.
Wasn't enough.
That's right.
That's right.
But none of this addresses the overspending. Why was there this overspending? That's the other.
Go ahead,
thing
Tom.
that's being addressed.
If I may, and I can kind of address that too. Attached to these are very brief income statements for each year. You'll see the majority of it is not an overspending, is the revenues didn't come in as projected. And I put a little note on there as to some of the reasons why.
Yeah.
Like at the Casper Event Center, there was a period of time it was down with the new seats being installed. A couple of years later, when there was a pretty good sized loss, that was when the ice and rain installation, a good portion of the facility couldn't be used. So it's more on the revenue side, and most places you'll see an expenditure reduction too, but not to the same level because there are so many fixed costs in running this that it doesn't equate. The other point I wanted to make too is with these types of funds, when the budget is prepared, we're budgeting expenses, we're budgeting revenues, and we're basically plugging the number to make it be zero. Very rarely, if ever, is it ever gonna come out exactly right. There's either gonna be some additional revenues or some additional expenses. It's not uncommon for these types of funds to fluctuate from year to year. So if there's a minimal loss, my recommendation is not necessarily to act on it right away, because there's a possibility that next year it may adjust itself. Some funds in these cases get to the point where the deficit is so much there's no, it has to be reconciled, it has to have an infusion of cash. But it's not uncommon for these types of funds just to have a little bit negative balance one year, the next year it could be positive, because all you're doing is you're budgeting, and this is trued up at the end of every year.
And you gotta close the books on
We
a
gotta
certain date.
close the books,
Right.
and there's a timing issue, and that's why we may watch over a period of
Yeah.
2 or 3 years and see, okay, it's not gonna recover, we need to fix it. So, yeah, I just wanna make that clear that it's, not every year you're gonna see every fund be positive or zero, you may see some of them, a minor negative.
Does it affect anything, Tom, that we tore those seats out, we tore the ice equipment out, it's about $800,000. That's in some, gonna be in some garage somewhere.
Charlie?
Well, let's bear in mind, 2015 caught pretty much everyone by surprise. And 15 and 16, people weren't spending a lot of money on entertainment. But your explanation was helpful, Carter. And I guess what I misunderstood is, I heard you refer to the legacy fund as capital L legacy fund, and really it was small case legacy fund, meaning just a term to describe this rather than an actual entity.
Right.
I would agree.
Okay, thank you.
And it would seem to me my only comment for it, just as looking at it and having that conversation too with Carter earlier, I don't think there was any devious malintent behind it. It would have been nice to, I guess, last year, the year before, to have a conversation with it about it, so we could be aware, so we weren't caught off guard. But I don't think there was, and some Tom and Carter's investigation and looking into it seemed to just be an oversight, unfortunately.
Well, let's be thankful we have the means to fix it. You know, it's not how we wanted to spend the money, but.
True.
So you have a kind of a breakdown with what you're on as well, and it's probably about $90,000 worth of the overall expense that.
Yep, close enough.
Would you want to give an update or pass it to the chief?
Oh, let's let the chief, yeah.
Let the chief. Go ahead, chief.
Thank you, Mayor, Council, City Manager. I apologize for being late earlier today, but I have a very good reason. I was thinking that maybe you could use a bright spot for the work session today. I'm here to announce that Officer Jacob Carlson has been released from the hospital today.
All right.
And he is home. It goes without saying that this is flat out miraculous. His post-incident recovery has been far accelerated faster than anybody's dreams. I visited with him in his home this afternoon, and he's comfortable, he's resting, and grateful to be out of that hospital bed. He still faces significant challenges, but I thought it was important that you and the city staff know that we've had a really good day in the police department today. He's doing really well. He has a positive attitude, and you know, his strength of will that is kind of guiding this recovery process is far outpacing the doctor's expectations. So I wanted you to know he's home and resting comfortably today, and it's a great day for the city of Casper.
Here, here.
Thank you. Very good.
Charlie, anything you want to mention on the legislative front?
No, just got WAM meeting this week, and there'll be some interesting things discussed. Well, I guess I can tell you that the executive director's report did review the corporations committee meeting, and they are prioritizing the sewer line problem, the sewer line problem, or the not sewer line, stormwater problem. I had sewer line on my mind
Kind of.
because we were talking about the warranty program, which, by the way, I said was a scam at the time, and I still believe it's a scam.
The sewer line program.
Now you're talking about the sewer
Not
line.
the stormwater, no. The sewer line warranty program.
Especially because it's misleading as to whether the city's doing it
Correct,
or
that's-
this other.
that's one of the things.
And that needs to be, we've never addressed that main problem, we should do
They won't do it without your seal.
Yeah, we were
That's-
concerned
so
about that
caved
when we
on
first
that.
took it on.
I didn't, I voted against the council.
Okay, council around the table. Chris, you have anything? I know we got CNFR this week.
CNFR is going on this week, so if anybody wants to go up there, there's tickets set aside. Just tell them you're on city council any of the days. Thursday's the recognition day. And I left a phone message, but you already picked up your tickets.
I got an
right?
email,
So-
and I got tickets, yeah, so.
All right, so I left a message for you guys that
I had to give them an ID and lease on my next grandchild, but they gave me the ticket.
So they'll be up there when we go up on Thursday.
Yeah, they should be at the will call. They'll be at the will call. When we had the appreciation mixer deal, later this year, after the parade, I believe is Bucking Saturday nights with the rodeo that's gonna be up there, outdoor events and that kind of stuff. Sinclair's involved in that, and so Tanya Lewis from Sinclair and Christine from the Event Center would like to, and I'm gonna give you some real specific dates, on Wednesday, I believe it was Wednesday, inflate that Sinclair dinosaur as a kickoff, and they were wondering if they could do it by our fountain over here. And of course I told them I didn't see why that would be a problem, but
As long as there's anchoring in place, that's good.
apparently they put this up around, I've never seen it up.
Plant to the fountain.
There you go by the neck.
Well, anyway, I can get some more details on that.
Yeah,
Shoot them
I don't
to
think
you.
that's a problem either.
I was in Cheyenne today at the Appropriations Committee, and that's the one on the gaming and all different forms of gaming, and potential for a gaming commission. There was no outcome on that or resolution to it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some kind of gaming oversight come from that. Would include all the potentials, sports betting, the gray games that are out there, everything but lottery, I suspect. So there'll be something occurring on that. No one really knows what it looks like just yet. That's all.
Mike? Any Nope. Bob?
Just a couple items. We got Amoco Reuse Joint Powers Board meeting tomorrow, and hope to have an update on the slurry walls that's going in, and maybe an update on some possibility of some new art on the path. We'll see how that goes. And then we have a meeting tentatively scheduled for later in the month to approve the or review the Economic Development Joint Powers Board budget for next year, the funding source for CADA. So, if you want to be there.
Sean?
I had a constituent come to me with a concern a while ago. Do we know who is responsible for Astor Street? It's a gravel road that runs between Robertson and Indian Paintbrush.
Mr. Mayor,
Upper or lower?
Yeah, what was it? Yeah, the whole thing connects.
I have
What-
someone who lives on Upper Astor.
and I think that's the street in question is Upper Astor versus Lower
Yeah.
Astor.
I think so.
I just had that conversation, Mr. Mayor, if I may. I just had that conversation with our Public Works Director, Public Services Director this week. And he's trying to find more information that would clarify really succinctly where the responsibility lies, and so.
What's the problem?
What was the complaint that you, because the guy that came to me was during, especially big rainstorms, all that gravel washes down into the gutters and into the stormwater system and plugs everything up and floods people's yards and houses and
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
My concern, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, was just that. Who is it that has the responsibility of maintaining the roads in such a degree that we don't have that that issue? To me, the obvious answer is to pave it and do away with that maintenance concern for, at least that type of maintenance concern forever. But I was unaware of that particular phone call, however, I have to confess, so I'm not aware who that might be. But in any case,
He called me directly, but
okay,
I have his number if you want it.
okay, sure.
But I think he said he thought it was a private road or it was privately funded by the homeowners up there, but I'm not.
That could be
I might be
too.
able to help, because I lived out there when that changed, and part of that didn't come into the city at the same time for some reason, and I don't
During
remember
the
what the deal was.
annexation, yeah.
So when it was annexed, there was part of that road that was already there, and that's the part that's probably still gravel.
Well, I drove the whole thing from Indian Paintbrush all the way to Robertson Road, and it's all gravel. The whole stretch there.
Of Upper Astor?
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
It's always been that way.
Right. It's causing problems in the stormwater system.
It could be a private road, that's a good point. We're finding out more, however.
Okay. That's all I have. Great, thanks.
Yes?
I'm glad we're hopefully going to address some of the issues that are going on within our city about, you know, soil samples and compacting and things like that. I do find it interesting, it's required for commercial building, the city of Casper requires it for the projects that we do. But when it comes to residential, I imagine if you would have talked to one of the people that just bought a $250,000 home for the first time, they're excited to customize it and everything, it's a drop in the bucket for now, it's uninhabitable, unfortunately, so, you know, I don't see an issue with that. We're not issuing or mandating fire suppression systems in the city of Casper like Gillette does in other cities in Wyoming, and we don't mandate, you know, backflow preventers for all new residential homes like Cheyenne does, for example. So hopefully we can address the needs of what we put in place that are realistic, that builders can follow. Outside of that, the first presentation that you had given, Carter, for the budget, I was just curious, the items that you said that would come up for future discussion, is that still going to take place? Because it's not on the grid, so I just wanted to make sure that at least we're going to talk about some of those topics.
Councilman, Mr. Mayor, absolutely. We've got some things we need your direction on that, you know, may or may not impact the budget for fiscal year 19, but we still need some direction. So
Okay.
even though you don't see it on the future items, you can count on those issues coming up. You bet. You dealt with a lot of it tonight with regard to the Katzie entry, but obviously we still have more to do in that realm.
No rush, I was just curious.
Sure.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Kenny?
I'd just say you probably need to get a majority of council to talk about soil stuff and so that we don't lose sight of what Jesse's talking about.
Sure. Good.
Mr. Mayor, Council, what that means to me is we would prepare a draft ordinance to talk about probably in a forum like this and determine whether or not in its current form at that point is appropriate to move to the floor for formal consideration.
And some cost estimates to the homeowner
Yes, sir.
and or the contractor.
You bet.
One of them's gonna pay for it.
Or what they could do is like these people who've lost 300 grand on
They'll
a
pass
house.
it on to the
The
homeowner.
losses are much huger than what I love that word, than what it would cost to prevent those
Sure.
problems.
You meant much more huger, didn't you?
Much more huger.
Anything else, Kenny?
I just don't want the developers to call me, so I'll tell them to call you guys. No, that's it.
Dallas, you have anything?
I want to make something clear about this legacy situation. This was not created by Carter and his staff. So I want to make that really clear to everybody. This was created in the Patterson era of time, and I don't believe, I don't know for sure whether there is anything wrong, since I'm not a CPA, and I don't think you're a CPA either. So I just don't buy off that it wasn't a problem. And I'm looking into it a little deeper with some people who understand these kind of things, because I'd like to know that it's either a problem or it isn't. It just doesn't sound right to me in my world when I hear something like this. It's just, it isn't walking like the duck that everybody's telling me it is. And I know Tom is sharp enough to catch all this stuff, so I'm really glad he's here. But if some past regime has created a problem, I want to know about it. And I want to know if it's cost this city money or it didn't cost us any money. But it just doesn't sound right to me. It's what I call money shuffling. And so I don't think anybody is doing anything wrong in your world, Carter.
Appreciate it.
You're the one who's bringing it, shining the light on it. So if it's somebody else's problem, it needs to fall there. Or it doesn't, whichever it is. But this compaction thing is really important. It's caused a lot of problems for people in this community. And this thing with Marvin Peel's building, I mean, it almost sounds crazy that he's got to spend, I forget what he told me, it's like a couple $1 million to put and he's telling me there's different ingresses and egresses up there. It's something I'd like, if you could look into it. If it's just absolutely, by golly, something we shouldn't be doing, I get that. But that place is built like a fortress, and there's not much in there that can even burn. And there's two different ways of getting out of there, as there always have been. And that was a very nice restaurant. People enjoyed it. People had wedding receptions up there. But to put a deal on there that costs that kind of money, I mean, you can never pay for it out of a restaurant. So if we're being too harsh there, or we're being fair there, I don't know. But I really would like to.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, Councilman, certainly, I think the discussion can be had with regard to determining whether or not we need to scale back that type of egress requirement. But I would say, and I'm glad Chief Harshman is here, because he would be the degree of testimony that I would rely upon pretty heavily to help us in this discussion. But I think it's important to note that council is really concerned, as maybe they should be, that we are looking at increasing requirements to protect property value. But we are suggesting potentially of reducing requirements to protect the value of human life. And so I want you to keep that dichotomy in mind as we go through this discussion, because I'm sure that's the level of testimony you will hear from Chief Harshman and his team as we consider potentially, obviously, an ordinance that would scale that back.
And I can understand that and I appreciate it, and that's why I'd like to have this information, because when somebody comes up and flops this kind of a problem on me, I don't know what to say to them.
Sure.
It almost
You bet.
sounds absurd. So if we get that kind of information, and and I believe that these gentlemen can do it, it's good enough for me. They're the experts.
You gotta wonder if he could insure it.
I don't know.
Do we want to give part of the direction to pursue what Dallas is asking?
I think if Dallas wants the information, then give him the information. I don't know that I would support an ordinance scaling back, or send it to all of council.
And I'm not suggesting that. It just sounds weird, and I don't have, the guy is really worried about it. He's 75 years old. He spent a couple million on the project. He's putting in this, I think he said $300,000 or $400,000 elevator, and I'm going, wow, and you're not gonna be able to open that restaurant? I mean, I love the picture that he brought to us, showing how it was all gonna be redone and everything. It'd be a great thing for Casper. But if it's dangerous, I understand that. It wasn't dangerous though for the last 80 years, is the problem.
I have a feeling that someone in the corner over there might say that it perhaps was dangerous for all those years when we always enjoyed it there.
There weren't airbags in cars for the past 80 years, seatbelts in cars.
And we all survived
Just
that
be-
too.
Every single, every policy,
We survived.
every code, everything has a situation associated with it.
You
more
in
than one.
for getting rid of seatbelts and airbags?
No, I'm not.
We're getting rid of seatbelts.
Yeah, child seats, the whole works.
Get rid of all of them. Get these costs down.
Charlie.
Well, I mean, I just assume there's good science on egress and how many people can get through a space of a certain size in a certain span of time, and that's all well researched, and that's why he's got to do more, is to meet those standards. But just going back to the Katzie discussion, I think this is setting up to look a lot like the museum discussion, where we will have some people come before us with very emotional presentations about how their lives will be, ruined by any change to the bus route system. And, I think it is like the museum situation. In a way, it's a test of our ability to withstand those things, look long-term, and sometimes make difficult decisions, knowing that there are always going to be people very upset with us, but we have an entire community to take care of. And when all this research is done, as was done with the MPO study, and says we can live with a route system that is smaller and less frequent, we should listen to that and not be overly affected by some anecdotal reports and reactions.
Mr. Mayor, If I may, it's, here, when we were doing budgets, we were supposed to talk about the Plains building, going forward with a couple of different plans,
That's on there.
and
we still on it?
I missed it.
No, it's on there.
Is it? I just,
It's
Probably
on,
sold
like
it to
maybe
the
2 weeks
tribes.
from now.
oh, is it? Okay,
It's on, yeah, we're gonna be talking about it here
okay,
soon, Bob.
I just missed it, thank you.
Are we gonna sell that to the tribes for a casino?
Mayor,
How about it?
Yes.
since Councilman Hopkins was able to just go back to around the table, I'd like to bring up one other item for discussion.
Bob, do you see what you just did?
I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Nice point,
Just-
Jesse, all right.
Of course, Jesse, you bet.
I forgot to mention, I think it would be worth, at least in the summer months, of removing or adding in that type of clause for open containers downtown for specific streets, such as Ash, David, Yellowstone, Second Street, Center Street. You know, every event that you go down there, you're seeing cups from that other place that has the liquor license, from this other place. And if we would only allow it for specific hours, I think we could make sure it's not out of control where you have people that are taking advantage of the issue. And if council doesn't decide that, plan B is when we are issuing permits for people to have an open container in their designated area, that they have to have a specific cup. So at that point, you know, an officer that's walking down the street, oh, you have this green Solo cup, I know it came from Yellowstone Garage, and you're at David Street Station, or you're in front of Frontier, for example. And then that's easy to say, hey, look, we have a problem at this location, are your signs up, do you have your security team, or are they looking for people walking past that barrier with an open container? Because you see a lot of that taking place. Last year was a perfect example of open containers for all of downtown, and it really wasn't an issue, so.
Chris, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, there's an avenue for anybody that's putting an event together to have an open container permit. And it's cool, I had a fire department beer at the Nick Fest
Right.
outside, but it's contained.
We have so many events from there all the way to Rock the Block, you know? And if you said only from, you know, whatever the time that events are going, whether it's on a Thursday night or, you know, Wednesday night, whatever's going on, for special events, you can have an open container, because you do have those instances where you have Nick Fest, you have something on Second Street, and then you have something at David Street, and then you have something at Yellowstone Garage, and people are walking that entire time.
You know, I think a lot of that falls on the people that are putting those events on to coordinate with each other and pull those permits. Or else how does it work? Do we look at a calendar of events and start applying when they can and when they can't? I just think it's easier logistically if Rock the Block and the Nick or whoever just does a coordinated effort.
Don't put me in handcuffs and tie me in a cage when I just wanna walk with that drink in my hand all the way. I don't wanna be tied to one area, and neither do my constituents, some of them.
Is that something council wants to,
It's the Las Vegas rule, everybody there walks up and down the street with a drink.
hearing what Chris said and hearing what Jesse, that's something council wants to pursue?
Smoking a doobie and drinking a drink, and going up and down the street.
Watching society improve, right?
Oh, they're making tons of money.
And that's all that can.
Cheyenne has gone
Not
the
saying
other way.
anything, Jess.
Cheyenne has gone the other way during
Guys.
Frontier Days.
I'll say yeah.
Certain
wanna hear it.
hours,
I wanna hear it.
we could even
Discuss
discuss
it.
days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Not doing it.
Mike, you're in?
Certain
3:30
hours,
to 8 p.m.
certain reasonable regulations, yeah.
How many?
5 hour window.
Can
I
I,
think there is
can I
5.
jump in and say
Yeah,
anything?
go ahead.
So we always view the world through the lens that we live in, right? This just, we have too many people that are irresponsible drinkers. If we make it a routine.
Ban alcohol in the city then.
Or not, just allow it wide open
Right,
in the open spaces where there's not gonna be any regulation.
What if
Right
you
now,
did
if you
it-
pulled an open container,
I'd say we should just have the discussion, we don't have to have it now, but.
you've gotta get approval from the police department. In a lot of cases, you have to have an officer there. how, you know, so we can't, with that model has to go out the door because there's no way they can do it right now if we designate Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'm not saying it's not something that I wouldn't enjoy doing. I just, I've never seen anything good come from a bunch of Casper residents drinking. Ever.
Chris, would you be open to having this discussion?
We could certainly solve a problem with one of our restaurants downtown. They could have
It
beer
sounds
in
just
front
like
of the
this.
restaurant.
I mean, I know, but it,
Sure, that's fine.
okay. So you guys are okay with the work session, talk about it, just, okay. The only thing that I have is that, I'm only a couple weeks behind on this because I promised you by the end of May, but things happen with the, judges. But I wanted to let you know too, I'll be setting up, an executive session here soon to talk about employee, evaluations, so we can get that taken care of.
Who swears in the judge?
They asked me to do that.
Okay.
If you guys are okay with me swearing in judge, you guys are okay?
Don't, you gotta wear a suit.
That won't work.
You can wear a tuxedo t-shirt.
Tuxedo t-shirt, will that work? A tuxedo t-shirt?
I guess the baby steps. We'll take those.
Mr. Mayor, is the judge gonna be sworn in at a council meeting?
Next Tuesday, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So next Tuesday she'll be sworn in. So anyway, I'll get something set up for us so we can start planning our evaluations for our employees. That's all I have. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks,
guys.
everybody.
See you all next week. Well done, Ray.
Thank you.
Come on, it'd be fun. Have a good time. It would be good people watching.
I'll bet that's gonna be